The winter of 1945 was drawing to a close, and the Allied forces were pushing deep into the heart of Nazi Germany. General George S. Patton, Jr., commanding the Third Army, had become a legend on the battlefield. A man known for his pearl-handled revolvers, his profanity-laced speeches, and his absolute refusal to accept anything less than total victory. But what happened when a German commander looked him in the eye and said words that would echo through the chaos of a dying war? What happened when pride met pride, when honor collided with surrender, and when two soldiers from opposite sides faced the hardest decision of all? This is a dramatized account, inspired by the character of General Patton and the documented final encounters between Allied and German forces in the closing days of World War II. While rooted in historical reality, the specific dialogue and details have been reconstructed to capture the spirit of these extraordinary moments. The spring of 1945 brought no warmth to Germany. The landscape was a tableau of destruction that stretched as far as the eye could see. Towns that had stood for centuries were reduced to skeletal ruins, their medieval churches and half-timbered houses now just piles of rubble and broken timber. The roads were clogged with refugees, German civilians fleeing westward, desperate to escape the advancing Soviet forces, preferring to take their chances with the Americans and British rather than face the Red Army's vengeance. General George S. Patton, Jr. sat in his command vehicle, studying maps that were being updated almost hourly as his Third Army continued its relentless advance. At 60 years old, he should have been slowing down, but the war seemed to energize him in ways that peace never could. His staff officers had learned to read his moods by the set of his jaw and the intensity of his gaze. Right now, that gaze was fixed on a small town marked on the map with a red circle, another objective, another obstacle between his army and the heart of the Reich. Patton's Third Army had become a machine of unprecedented efficiency. Since breaking out of Normandy the previous summer, they had swept across France with such speed that they'd outrun their own supply lines. Patton had driven his men hard, sometimes too hard according to his critics, but the results spoke for themselves. While other Allied commanders were still consolidating positions and waiting for reinforcements, Patton was already miles ahead, seizing bridges before the Germans could blow them, capturing towns before the enemy could organize a defense. But speed had its price. The men were exhausted, pushed to the limits of human endurance. The tanks were breaking down from constant use, their engines never getting the maintenance they needed. And the casualties, while lighter than they might have been in a slower, more methodical advance, were still mounting day by day. Every morning, Patton received reports of men killed, wounded, or missing, and every morning, he hardened himself against the numbers and pushed forward. His philosophy was simple, even brutal in its logic. A moving army was a surviving army. The longer you stayed in one place, the more time the enemy had to bring up artillery, to lay mines, to prepare defenses. Keep moving, keep the pressure on, and eventually the enemy would break. It had worked in France, it had worked in the Battle of the Bulge when he'd relieved Bastogne in record time, and it was working now as Germany itself crumbled under the weight of the Allied advance. But there were moments, brief pauses in the relentless forward motion, when something unexpected would happen. When the war would suddenly become personal in a way that even Patton, with all his study of military history and his belief in destiny and reincarnation, couldn't quite anticipate. The radio crackled to life. "General, this is Colonel Hayes, 4th Armored Division. We've encountered a situation that requires your attention." Patton picked up the handset. His voice was sharp, impatient. "Hayes, I don't have time for situations. I have time for results." "What's the problem?" There was a pause on the other end, and Patton could hear the sounds of battle in the background, the distant thump of artillery, the rattle of small arms fire. "Sir, we've got a German position surrounded. Small force, maybe company strength, holed up in some buildings on the eastern edge of this town we just took. Standard mop-up operation, or should have been. So mop them up." "What am I, your nursemaid?" "Sir, they're refusing to surrender. Their commanding officer sent out a message through one of the local civilians who speaks English. Says he won't surrender under any circumstances. Says we'll have to kill him and every man with him." Patton's jaw tightened. This wasn't the first time he'd encountered German fanatics willing to die for a lost cause. Usually they were SS, true believers in Hitler's insanity who would rather go down fighting than face the reality of defeat. His standard response was simple: grant them their wish. Artillery bombardment, followed by infantry assault. Quick, brutal, and effective. But something in Hayes's tone suggested there was more to the story. What else? Sir, the officer gave his name. Says he's a colonel, career military, not a party member. Says he knows the war is lost but he can't bring himself to surrender. It's strange, sir. He's not making threats or demands. He's just stating a fact. Says if we want the position, we'll have to take it by force. Patton was silent for a moment, his mind working through the possibilities. Not a Nazi upstart, but old guard. The kind of officer who'd been serving since before Hitler was anything more than a failed artist and political agitator. I'm coming to your position, Patton said abruptly. Don't fire on them until I get there. But keep them contained. If they try anything, put them down. Yes, sir. But sir, is this really necessary? I mean, we can handle this without. Colonel Hayes, when I want your opinion on what's necessary, I'll ask for it. Until then, you'll follow orders. Clear. Crystal clear, sir. Patton handed the radio back to his communications officer and turned to his aide, a young captain named Robert Marsh who'd been with him since the North Africa campaign. Marsh had seen Patton in every mood imaginable: triumphant, furious, contemplative, even briefly vulnerable in those rare moments when the mask slipped. Right now, he couldn't quite read what the general was thinking. Sir, what's the play here? Patton stood and reached for his helmet, with its distinctive 4 stars gleaming even in the dim light of the command vehicle. The play, Captain, is that I want to look this German bastard in the eye before I decide whether to kill him or accept his surrender. Sometimes you can tell more from 5 minutes face-to-face than from 100 intelligence reports. And if he really won't surrender? Then we'll accommodate his death wish and move on. War doesn't stop for stubborn fools. The drive to Hayes's position took 20 minutes, winding through streets that had been reduced to obstacle courses of rubble and abandoned vehicles. German civilians watched from windows and doorways, their faces blank with shock and exhaustion. Some waved white flags or sheets, desperate to show they weren't resisting. Others just stared, too numb to react. Patton saw it all with a detached observation of a man who'd seen too many conquered cities to be moved by one more. He'd walked through the ruins of ancient battlefields as a young officer, had studied the campaigns of history's great commanders. Destruction was nothing new. The human capacity for creating ruins was as old as civilization itself. But there was something different about Germany in 1945. This wasn't just military defeat. This was the complete collapse of a society that had believed itself invincible just a few years earlier. The Third Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years was disintegrating after barely 12, and the German people were finally seeing the price of their collective delusion. Patton had complicated feelings about the Germans. He respected their military prowess. They'd been formidable enemies, far better soldiers than the Italians or most others. He admired their historical military tradition, had studied Prussian tactics extensively. But he despised the Nazis with a fury that sometimes surprised even him. The ideology, the racial theories, the casual brutality, all of it represented everything Patton found contemptible. And now he was going to meet another German officer, one who claimed to embody the old military traditions rather than the Nazi perversion of them. Patton was skeptical. He'd heard that line before, usually from officers trying to distance themselves from atrocities once they realized the war was lost. I was just a soldier, not a Nazi. As if there was a meaningful difference when you'd spent years fighting for Hitler's regime. Hayes was waiting when Patton's jeep pulled up. He saluted crisply, and Patton returned it with casual precision. The colonel was a good officer, steady and reliable, exactly the kind of subordinate Patton valued. Not brilliant, perhaps, but competent and willing to follow orders without constant second-guessing. Status? Patton asked, climbing out of the jeep. No change, sir. They're holed up in those 3 buildings. Hayes pointed to a cluster of structures about 200 yards away. We've got them completely surrounded. I pulled back our men when you said you were coming, but we can bring up tanks and finish this in 10 minutes if you give the word. Patton studied the buildings through his binoculars. Standard German construction, solid, good defensive positions. Taking them would cost American lives, not many probably, but some. And for what? A few dozen German soldiers who'd be prisoners within the hour anyway. Unless they really did fight to the death. Then it was a waste of lives on both sides. The colonel. What else did he say? Hayes pulled out a notebook. I had the civilian write it down. Tell your commanding officer that I will not surrender my position. This is not a threat or negotiation. It is simply fact. If the American forces wish to occupy this position, they will have to take it by force. My men and I will resist to our last breath. That's it, sir. Nothing else. Patton read the note himself, his eyes narrowing. The phrasing was formal, almost ceremonial. This wasn't the ranting of a fanatic or the desperation of a man with no options. This was something else entirely. How many men does he have? Best estimate is about 40. Mix of infantry and some headquarters personnel. Lightly armed. No heavy weapons that we've seen. But they'll make us pay for it. Yes, sir. Probably cost us a dozen casualties, maybe more if they've mined the buildings. Patton handed the binoculars to Marsh. Get me a white flag. I'm going to talk to this officer myself. Hayes's eyes widened. Sir, that's not... I mean, we don't know if we can trust them. They might. They might what, Colonel? Shoot me? Then you flatten the buildings and everyone inside dies anyway. But I don't think they will. This one strikes me as old school, and old school Prussian officers don't shoot men under a flag of truce. 10 minutes later, Patton was walking across the open ground between the American lines and the German positions, a white flag carried by a sergeant walking slightly ahead of him. Marsh had insisted on coming along, and Patton had allowed it. The young captain had earned the right to be foolish alongside his commanding officer. The day was overcast, the sky a uniform gray that seemed to press down on the ruined landscape. Somewhere in the distance, artillery continued its steady rumble, but here in this small corner of the war, there was an eerie quiet. Patton could feel the eyes on him from both sides. His own men watching with concern, the Germans watching from windows with weapons trained on the small party approaching their position. They were halfway across when a German officer emerged from the central building. He was tall, probably 6'2", with a ramrod posture that seemed bred into Prussian military men. His uniform was field gray, showing wear but maintaining its dignity. He wore the Iron Cross at his throat and several other decorations. The German officer stopped about 20 feet away and waited. There was no fear in his stance, no aggression, just formal patience. Patton closed the distance until they were perhaps 10 feet apart. Close enough to talk without shouting, far enough to maintain formality. For a long moment, the two men simply looked at each other, taking measure. The German spoke first, his English clear despite a heavy accent. General Patton, I recognize you from photographs. I am a colonel of the German army, commanding what remains of my regiment. Colonel. Patton's voice was neutral. Your men tell me you won't surrender. That is correct, General. Mind telling me why the hell not? The German glanced back at his building, then returned his gaze to Patton. May we speak more privately, General? What I have to say is not for the ears of my men or yours. Patton considered this, then nodded. He turned to Marsh and the sergeant. Wait here. If I'm not back in 15 minutes, assume things went badly. Sir, I really don't think. That's an order, Captain. Patton followed the German into the building. It had been some kind of office before the war, with high ceilings and good windows. Now it was a makeshift fortress, with furniture piled against windows and German soldiers positioned at strategic points. They watched Patton with wary eyes, their weapons ready but not pointed directly at him. The colonel led him to a small back room. There was a desk, 2 chairs, little else. The German gestured to one of the chairs and took the other himself once Patton was seated. You speak English well, Patton observed. Thank you, General. I studied before the First War. Ancient history and military strategy. It seems like several lifetimes ago now. You're a long way from there, Colonel. Indeed. Though I suspect we have both traveled far from where we began. The Colonel pulled out a cigarette case, offered one to Patton, who declined, then lit one for himself. His hands were steady. You said you wanted to talk privately, Patton prompted. So talk. Make it quick. I've got a war to win and you're slowing me down. A ghost of a smile crossed the German's face. Direct. Very well, General, I will be equally direct. I will not surrender because I cannot live with what comes after. Every German officer says that. Usually right before they surrender anyway. Perhaps. But I mean it. You see, General Patton, I am not a Nazi. I never joined the party, despite considerable pressure. I am a professional soldier from a family that has served Germany for generations. My great-grandfather fought at Waterloo. My grandfather served in the Wars of Unification. My father died at Verdun in 1916. And I have served for over 30 years, through the Great War, through everything after, and now through this nightmare. He took a long drag on his cigarette. I tell you this not to excuse anything, but to explain. When Hitler came to power, many of us in the officer corps thought we could control him, use him to rebuild Germany's strength and then contain him. We were arrogant and we were wrong. By the time we understood what he truly was, it was too late. And we went along. We told ourselves we were serving Germany, not the Nazis. We told ourselves we were keeping alive the true military traditions while the madness ran its course. And now, Patton's voice was hard. Now that you've lost, now that the madness has destroyed your country, you want to pretend you were never part of it? No, General. That is precisely the point. I cannot pretend. I wore this uniform. I served this regime. I may not have believed in their ideology, but I enabled them. And now I must face the consequences. Patton leaned back. You still haven't explained why you won't surrender. The Colonel stubbed out his cigarette with careful precision. Because I know what comes next. Trials. Interrogations. Officers asking me about war crimes, about the camps, about every order I gave. And the answer is that I knew. Perhaps not all the details, but I knew enough. We all did. The rumors, the whispers, the things you couldn't help but hear. His voice grew quieter. And I did nothing. I told myself it wasn't my concern, that I was a soldier, not a politician. I focused on my men, on tactics, on the clean parts of war if such things exist. I convinced myself that I could serve with honor in a dishonorable cause. And I was wrong. So you want to die rather than face that. Better to die fighting than to live in shame. Patton stood abruptly and walked to the window. For a long moment, he said nothing. When he spoke, his voice carried contempt mixed with something that might have been understanding. I've studied war my whole life, Colonel. Every campaign, every battle, every great commander. You know what I learned? Honor's a luxury. Something generals talk about in peacetime and forget when the shooting starts. He turned to face the German. You say you knew about the camps. You say you did nothing. That's not lack of honor. That's cowardice. You were scared of what would happen if you spoke up, so you kept quiet and told yourself you were being honorable. The Colonel's face flushed, but he said nothing. And now you want to die fighting because you think that somehow makes up for it? That going down in battle means you don't have to answer for what you didn't do when it mattered? That's not honor, Colonel. That's still cowardice. Just looking for an easier way out. How dare you? How dare I what? Tell you the truth? You know better than to give me this romantic garbage about a warrior's death. Real warriors don't throw their lives away on lost causes. They face consequences. The Colonel stood, his face dark with anger. You know nothing about the choices I faced. You were not here. You did not have to make these impossible decisions. You're right. I wasn't here. I was in America, training for a war I knew was coming. And when it came, I fought for my country. Patton moved closer. But if my government had gone down the same path as yours, if we'd started rounding people up and putting them in camps, I'd like to think I would have done something. Had the guts to resign my commission, to speak out, to do something other than just going along. He paused. But maybe I wouldn't have. Maybe I would have told myself the same things you did. I don't know for sure. But here's the difference. If I had done what you did, I'd have the balls to face the consequences rather than looking for a quick exit. The two men stood face to face, neither willing to look away. Finally, the colonel spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. What would you have me do, General? Surrender. Face trial. Tell the truth about what you saw. Help make sure this never happens again, even if it means years being interrogated. That's hard. That takes real courage. Dying is easy. Living with what you've done, that's the real test. The silence stretched between them, broken only by distant sounds of war and the breathing of two men who'd both spent their lives in uniform. The colonel returned to his chair, moving like a man who'd suddenly aged 20 years. You make it sound so simple. It is simple. Not easy, but simple. Surrender. Face what comes. Or die here in this pointless last stand and let someone else do the work while you escape into the myth of the honorable soldier. My men. Your men will follow whatever choice you make. They're looking to you for leadership. If you choose death, they'll die with you. If you choose surrender, they get to go home eventually. Which choice actually serves them? The colonel put his head in his hands. When he looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed. You are a hard man, General Patton. I'm a realistic man. I've seen too much death to romanticize it. Patton moved toward the door, then paused. I'm going to tell you something that doesn't leave this room. After the last war, I was stationed in Germany for occupation duty. And I met German officers like you, professional military men who'd served with what they thought was honor. Good soldiers. His voice took on a distant quality. And I liked them. Respected them. They were worthy enemies. But then I saw what happened. I saw how Germany fell apart, how the nationalist movements took hold, how men who should have known better supported the Nazis because they promised to restore German pride. And I realized that good soldiers can enable terrible things. He looked directly at the colonel. So I'm not going to let you off easy. You served a monstrous regime. You may not have been a true believer, but you were complicit. And the only way you can begin to make that right is to live and face what comes next. The colonel stood slowly. And if I refuse? If I insist on fighting? Then I'll kill you and every man in this building. It'll take about 30 minutes. Then I'll move on to the next objective and forget you ever existed. You'll just be another dead German officer. No ceremony. No honor. No glory. Just death. In 50 years, nobody will remember your name. Your family will be ashamed. Everything you think you're preserving by dying here will be lost anyway. Patton opened the door. You've got 1 hour, Colonel. Either you surrender yourself and your men, or I give the order to attack. Choose based on reality, not on some romantic notion. Those days are gone. This war killed them. He walked out, leaving the colonel alone. Marsh was waiting outside, looking relieved. Sir? What happened? We're going to wait 1 hour. If they don't surrender by then, we attack. Do you think he'll surrender? Patton looked back at the building. I don't know, Captain. Pride makes people do stupid things. They returned to the American lines. Patton checked his watch and settled in to wait. Hayes approached, but Patton waved him off. This wasn't the time for tactical discussions. The minutes crawled by. 40 minutes passed. Then 50. Patton checked his watch again and stood, preparing to give the order. And then the door opened. The colonel walked out, alone, carrying a white flag. He walked slowly across the open ground until he stood before Patton. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then the colonel reached up and unbuckled his service pistol. He held it out to Patton. I surrender myself and my men to you, General Patton. I ask that they be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Patton took the pistol, hefted it once, then handed it to Marsh. They will be. You have my word. The colonel nodded slowly. Thank you, General. I don't know if I'm making the right choice. But you convinced me that dying here would accomplish nothing except to satisfy my pride. It's about choosing the harder path because it's the one that matters. The German soldiers began filing out, their hands raised, their weapons left behind. They looked exhausted, relieved, and scared. American soldiers moved forward to process them. As the German soldiers were being marched away, the colonel paused. General Patton, may I ask you something? Go ahead. Why did you come yourself? You could have simply ordered the attack. Patton was quiet for a long moment. Because 30 years ago, you and I were both fighting in France. We were on opposite sides of the same damn war, and we were told it would be the last one. And we failed. Our whole generation failed. He looked directly at the colonel. I talked to you because I wanted to make sure that at least once, at least today, something ended the right way. Not with more pointless death, but with a choice that might lead somewhere better. The colonel nodded slowly. Thank you, General. Don't thank me yet. You've got years of hard times ahead. Yes. But as you said, easier isn't always right. Patton watched as the last prisoners were loaded into trucks. Then he turned to Hayes. Get these men processed. By the book. Anyone mistreats them answers to me. Yes, sir. As Patton climbed back into his jeep, Marsh settled in beside him. Sir, can I ask you something? What is it, Captain? That speech you gave him. Did you mean all of it? Patton looked at his aide. Both and neither, Captain. The truth is, I don't know what I would have done in his place. None of us do. But he had education, training, understanding. He knew better. And knowing better means you have a responsibility to act. Marsh thought about this. What do you think will happen to him? I don't know. Depends on what he did during the war. Could be he spends time in custody and goes home. Could be he faces serious charges. Either way, he chose to face it. That counts for something. They drove in silence, passing through the ruins of another German town. The war was winding down. Germany was defeated. But the aftermath, the reckoning, that was just beginning. Patton knew he wouldn't be around for most of it. He was a warrior, not a peacekeeper. Once the fighting stopped, he'd be obsolete. The thought didn't bother him as much as it should have. He'd lived for war his whole life. But sometimes he wondered about the cost. Not just in blood and treasure, but to the human soul. What did it do to a man to spend his life preparing for war? What did it do to a society to glorify military virtues above all else? Captain Marsh, do you know why I really went to talk to that German colonel? Marsh was surprised. Sir, it wasn't just tactical. It was because I saw something of myself in him. Not the Nazi part, but the professional soldier part. The man who's devoted his life to the military. And I wanted to see if there was any way to salvage that, to separate the honorable parts of military tradition from the horrors they can be used to justify. And did you? Patton shrugged. I don't know. He surrendered, which was right. But does that redeem anything? I can't answer that. I'm not a priest. I'm just a soldier trying to win a war. They arrived back at headquarters, and Patton's attention immediately shifted. Reports were waiting, decisions to be made, orders to be given. The war continued, relentless and demanding. But that night, alone in his quarters, Patton found himself thinking about the German colonel. Wondering what would become of him. Wondering if the choice to surrender would haunt him more than dying would have. He poured himself a whiskey and sat at his desk, looking at maps that showed the Third Army's advance into Germany. In a few weeks, they'd link up with the Soviets. The Reich would be crushed. The war in Europe would be over. And then what? Patton had never been good at peace. The time between the wars had been torture, watching his career stagnate. He'd studied and trained and prepared, always knowing another war was coming. But this war had to be the last one. It had to be. The weapons were too powerful, the destruction too complete. If humanity survived this, it would have to find another way. The alternative was extinction, which meant professional soldiers like him were becoming obsolete. Warriors in an age that couldn't afford warriors. The thought was both melancholy and strangely liberating. If this truly was the last war, at least he'd been part of it. He'd commanded armies, won victories, left his mark on history. But at what cost? How many men had died following his orders? He could justify it tactically. Every casualty had been necessary. But on a human level, the weight was almost unbearable. He drank his whiskey and tried not to think about it. That way lay madness. Better to focus on the mission, on clear objectives. Take that town. Secure that bridge. The details were manageable. It was only when you stepped back that it became overwhelming. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Marsh, carrying reports. "Sorry to disturb you, sir, but these just came in. They thought you'd want to see them." Patton flipped through them. More information about German dispositions, more evidence that the end was near. "Anything urgent?" "Just one thing, sir. There's a note about that colonel. He's being transferred for interrogation. Intelligence wants to debrief him about German capabilities." "That's standard." "Yes, sir. But there's also mention of investigating his unit's activities. Possible incidents involving civilians." Patton set down the folder. "What kind of incidents?" "The details are unclear. Witness reports placing his unit in certain areas. That's what the investigation is for. Keep me informed." "Yes, sir." Marsh hesitated. "Sir, why do you care? I mean, he's just another German officer." "I don't know, Captain. Maybe because I talked to him. Maybe because I convinced him to surrender. If it turns out he was responsible for atrocities, it complicates things." After Marsh left, Patton sat with his thoughts. The conversation had been about honor, about facing consequences, about choosing the harder path. But what if the consequences were worse than either had imagined? Then the choice to surrender would be even harder to bear. Death would have been an escape. By choosing to live, the colonel would have to face everything. Which was exactly what Patton had told him to do. But it was easier to say when you didn't know the details. Easier to talk about honor when you were the victor, when your country had been on the right side. What would Patton have done if the situations were reversed? Would he have had the courage to resist? Or would he have done what the colonel did, focused on duty, ignored the horror, convinced himself he was serving honorably? He wanted to believe he would have been different. But he'd seen enough to know that courage and principle were easier in theory than practice. When your life was on the line, when your family was threatened, when every institution told you that what you were doing was right, it was easy to judge from outside. Much harder to act with clarity from inside. These were the thoughts that haunted Patton in the closing days of the war. Not tactical concerns, but deeper questions about duty and morality, about what it meant to be a soldier when soldiers had enabled such terrible things. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. There were celebrations, relief, joy, but also exhaustion, trauma, and growing awareness of just how much had been destroyed. Patton remained in Germany through the summer, overseeing occupation duties. He found peacetime governance frustrating. The military was good at destroying things. Rebuilding was somebody else's job, but there wasn't anybody else. He never saw the German colonel again. Through unofficial channels, he heard that investigations continued for months. The man had been an officer in the German army, had served the Nazi regime. Being cleared of direct involvement in specific crimes didn't erase complicity in the larger horror. Eventually the colonel was released and disappeared into post-war Germany. Just another defeated officer trying to rebuild a life in the ruins. Patton himself didn't have much longer. In December 1945, he was injured in a car accident near Mannheim and died 12 days later from his injuries. His death came suddenly, unexpectedly, ending the life of one of America's most controversial and effective generals just as the war he'd helped win was transitioning to peace. His legacy was debated then and continues to be debated now. Was he a brilliant commander or a reckless hothead? A patriot or a glory hound? A military genius or a political liability? Probably all of the above. Men like Patton don't fit neatly into categories. They're too large, too complex, too contradictory. But on that March day in 1945, when he convinced a German colonel to choose life over death, to choose facing consequences over escaping them, he showed a side of himself that even his closest aides rarely saw. Not the warrior who loved battle, but the man who understood that sometimes the hardest fights aren't won with weapons. Decades later, Marsh, by then retired, was interviewed about his time with Patton. He was asked if there were any moments that stood out, any incidents that revealed who Patton really was beneath the legend. He thought for a long time before answering. There was this one day, toward the end. We'd surrounded a small German force, and their commander refused to surrender. General Patton could have just ordered an assault. Instead, he spent an hour talking to this officer, convincing him that surrendering was the harder choice but the right one. "Why did that stand out?" the interviewer asked. "Because it was the only time I saw Patton choose persuasion over force. The only time I saw him recognize that his enemy was a human being facing an impossible choice, not just an obstacle. He was hard on that German officer, didn't let him hide behind excuses. But he also gave him a chance to make a better choice." Do you think the German made the right choice? Marsh was quiet. "I don't know. He lived to face judgment, which is what Patton thought he should do. But I don't know what happened after. Maybe he found some redemption. Maybe he just lived with guilt. Either way, he chose the harder path. That has to count for something." "And what about Patton? Do you think he believed in redemption?" "I think Patton believed in duty and honor and service. I think he believed soldiers had a responsibility to face consequences. Whether that's the same as redemption, I don't know. He was a complicated man. Brilliant and flawed. Like most people. Just more so." The interview ended there. Marsh died a few years later, taking with him his memories of Patton and the war. The story of the German colonel who refused to surrender became a footnote, if that, in the larger history. There were bigger battles, more dramatic moments, clearer heroes and villains. But for those who were there, who witnessed that encounter between two professional soldiers facing the end of an era, it remained significant. Not because of what was said, but because of what it represented. The possibility that even in the worst of wars, even between the bitterest of enemies, there could be moments of human connection. Whether that possibility means anything in the grand scheme of history is debatable. The war ended. Germany was defeated. The world moved on. New conflicts emerged. The military traditions that both Patton and the colonel had served became increasingly irrelevant in an age of nuclear weapons. But for 1 hour on a gray March day in 1945, two old soldiers sat across from each other and talked about honor, duty, and the price of the lives they'd led. One walked away to continue fighting. The other walked away to face consequences. And perhaps that's all any of us can do. Make our choices, face our consequences, and hope that somewhere along the way, we find something worth preserving, something that makes the struggle meaningful. The war destroyed that possibility.